James Wilson kicked the door of his black Ford, almost dropping that damn bouquet of roses from his hands. 12 of them, red as blood, with long stems, that he had picked out from the flower shop on the corner of Lincoln Avenue because he knew Emily loved them. In his other hand, he clutched a bottle of Pinot Noir, her favorite, with a label that always gave her a thrill, like it was some kind of fucking work of art. Today was exactly 11 years since he first saw her in a bar on the outskirts of Chicago, with her hair disheveled and that smile of hers that made his knees go weak. 11 fucking years old, and he was still sneaking her flowers like some lovesick puppy. The clock on the dashboard showed 1847. He got out of the car, slamming the door so that the echo echoed throughout the quiet suburb. Their house, a two-story brick beauty with white shutters and a lawn that he mowed himself every Saturday, stood at the end of the street, basking in the golden light of sunset. James straightened his tie and loosened the top button of his shirt. After 10 hours in the office, he looked like he'd been run over by a truck, but he still wanted to look decent for her. "Surprise, baby," he muttered to himself as he walked along the stone path to the front door. Usually he returned later, closer to 8, but today he deliberately left the company early. I wanted to take her by surprise, maybe even drag her into bed before dinner. Hell, he even grinned when he imagined her surprised face. The key turned in the lock with a slight click. James stepped inside, and the smell of the house, a mixture of her perfume with a hint of vanilla, and something woody from the candles she was always burning, astounded his nostrils. The living room was silent, except for the ticking of the wall clock above the fireplace. He kicked off his shoes at the door without taking them all off, $200 shoes, black, polished to a shine, and walked through the hall, clutching the flowers so that the thorns dug into his palm. Are you home?" he shouted, but there was no answer. Maybe she's in the shower, he thought, or messing around in the kitchen with those stupid Pinterest recipes of hers. He walked up the stairs, walking quietly so as not to startle her if she really hadn't heard. On the second floor, the light came through from under the door of their bedroom, soft, warm, from the lamp that stood by the bed. James could already imagine how he would come in, throw flowers on the chest of drawers, and throw her on the bed while the wine waited in the wings. But as he came closer, a sound reached him. At first it was quiet, barely perceptible, the creaking of the mattress springs rhythmic, as if someone was moving back and forth. And then the voice. Her voice. Low, hoarse, with those damn familiar moans that he had heard hundreds of times, but never thought he would hear like this. James froze. His heart pounded in his chest, as if it wanted to burst out and break his ribs. He stepped towards the door, which was only a couple of inches open, and pushed it open with his fingertips. The door slid open silently, revealing a scene that nearly made him vomit on the carpet. Emily Wilson, his wife, his fucking queen, lay on their bed, the same one where they slept every night, where he had sex with her on the weekends, where she swore her love for him after every fight. Her long blonde hair was spread out on the pillow, her eyes were closed, her mouth was open, and above her, between her spread legs, was Michael Davis. Michael, motherfucking Davis, is his best friend, his partner in the firm, the same bastard with whom he drank whiskey in the office until midnight, discussing business and women. His bare ass flashed in time with her moans, and his hands squeezed her hips as if it were his personal prize. "Oh, Michael, yes, like that, don't stop," Emily breathed, digging her nails into his back. Her voice trembled with pleasure, and every word stabbed into James like a knife into his guts. He stood in the doorway like a damn pillar, unable to move. The roses in his hand trembled. One petal fell off and fell to the floor, red like a blood stain on a white carpet. Michael muttered something in her ear, something dirty, judging by the way she giggled, and arched even more under him. They didn't even notice him. They didn't hear how the floorboard creaked under his weight. They didn't see how the shadow of his figure lay on the wall. James felt the heat rise from his chest to his throat, and then an icy cold that froze everything inside. He wanted to scream, throw a bottle at this fucking couple, smack Michael in his grinning face so that his teeth fell to the floor. But instead he just stood there, watched. He listened to how his wife had fun under another man, how she whispered his name, not his, but this fucking traitor. Finally, he took a step back, carefully, slowly, as if he was afraid to wake them. The fingers unclenched, and the bouquet plopped onto the floor at the threshold of the bedroom. 12 roses, tied with a black ribbon, now lay there like someone's grave. The bottle remained in his hand, the cold glass biting into his skin as he walked down the stairs. He didn't slam the door, didn't make a sound. I just went outside, got into the car, and started the engine. Emily was still moaning somewhere up there, giving herself to Michael as James pulled out of the driveway. She didn't know he was there. I didn't know what he saw, and she certainly didn't know that this bouquet would be the last thing he gave her. James Wilson was born in a dusty hole called Clarion, Iowa, where the only sounds in the morning were the mooing of cows and the creaking of a rusty weather vane on a barn. The summer of 1986 was hot, and he was born right on the kitchen table of their old farmhouse, not because it was romantic, but because John Wilson, his father, did not have time to take Mary to the hospital in the neighboring town. Mary was screaming so loudly that the glass in the windows was shaking, and John, red from sweat and the whiskey with which he was cheering himself up, swore at the top of his lungs until a local midwife came running with a suitcase and pulled the baby out into this fucking world. "It's a boy, motherfucker. We're having a boy," John roared, slamming the table so that the coffee mug toppled over and spilled on the floor. The Wilsons' house stood in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by fields of corn that stretched to the horizon, as if someone had spilled yellow paint and forgotten to stop. The wooden walls were peeling from the wind and sun, the roof naked every spring, and the inside always smelled of manure and cheap tobacco, which John rolled himself while sitting on the porch in the evenings. James grew up amid this crap, a barefoot kid with freckles and skinny arms that he hated because they couldn't even lift a full basket of grain. His father called him wimpy and laughed when he stumbled over bumps while fetching water from the well. "What are you, a wench? Move your ass, Jamie," John yelled, puffing on his stinking cigarette. Mary was different. Thin, with faded blonde hair, which she pinned up with rusty hairpins, she spent all day fiddling around in the kitchen or in the garden, trying to grow at least something edible on this damned land. Her hands were calloused, and her eyes were always red from the tears that she hid while kneading dough or peeling potatoes. She loved James, but she didn't know how to show it. Instead of hugs, she would give him a bowl of porridge or an old shirt darned at the knee. "Work, son, and you'll get out of here," she said quietly when John fell asleep in his rocking chair, drunk as hell after another bottle of moonshine. When James turned 7, Sarah was born. Mary was screaming again on the same table, and John was swearing again, but this time he was more sober and even managed to bring the same old midwife. Sarah came out small, with a thin squeak instead of a scream, and James immediately hated her for taking his mother away from him. Mary was now rocking her in her arms, singing some stupid songs, and all he could hear was shouts. "Don't make any noise, James. You'll wake up your sister." But after a couple of years, he got used to it. Sarah followed him around like a puppy, with those huge gray eyes of hers and that mass of dark curls that always got in her face. They climbed through the hayloft together, chased chickens, and threw stones at an old tin can until John yelled that he would kill them for misbehaving. Life on the farm was shitty, but predictable. In the morning, milk the cows. In the afternoon, carry hay or clean the barn. In the evening, eat overcooked potatoes with a piece of corned beef, if you're lucky. James hated this smell of manure that ate into his skin, these calluses on his hands, this endless dirt under his nails. But most of all, he hated his father. John was as strong as a bull, with broad shoulders and fists that could bring down a horse. He yelled at everyone, hit Mary if dinner wasn't ready, and kicked James for every little thing spilling milk, dropping a pitchfork, digging with wood for too long. "You're worthless, boy, just like your mother," he growled, and James clenched his teeth, dreaming of one day punching him so hard that he would choke on his own blood. School became his salvation. Small, with peeling paint and desks scratched by generations of the same farm children, it stood 3 miles from home. James walked there, even in the rain, with a backpack that Mary sewed for him from an old bag. The teacher, Miss Hart, an old maid with gray curls, noticed that he was not stupid, like most of the locals. He devoured the books she gave him, from To Kill a Mockingbird to some tattered history books, and by the time he was 10 he knew he didn't want to rot on that farm like John. "You're smart, James Wilson," Miss Hart said one day, looking at him over her glasses. "Get out of here while you can." And he decided that he would get out. Whether on his knees or crawling, he will leave this hell. Sarah grew up differently. Wild as a weed, she hated school and anything that smacked of rules. She fought with boys in the yard, stole apples from neighbors, and laughed when they beat her with a belt for it. James sometimes defended her, sometimes he yelled at her, but deep down he loved this little devil. They were a team against John, against this damn farm, against everything that tried to break them. But at 16, Sarah broke down on her own. It all started with another quarrel. John got drunk after selling the cow for half price and came at Mary with his fists. Sarah, no longer a small girl, but a skinny girl with a sharp tongue, climbed between them. "You drunken pig, leave her," she screamed, and John slapped her so hard that she fell to the floor, holding her cheek. James, who was 19 at the time, stood in the corner, clenching his fists, but didn't move. He was too used to this shit. And Sarah stood up, wiped the blood from her lip, and looked at everyone with such hatred that it gave James a chill. "I'm leaving," she spat, and Mary began to cry, grabbing her hand. "Where are you, you fool, looking at night?" The mother shouted, but Sarah broke free, grabbed her backpack, and slammed the door so that the hinges cracked. James ran after her. I caught up with her by the road, where she stood with her head raised to the sky, as if there was her ticket out of here. "Sarah, come back, he'll cool down," he said, grabbing her shoulder. She twitched as if scalded. "I'm not going back to this shithole. And neither should you. Leave, James, or you'll rot with them." She went into the darkness. Her curls flashed in the light of the moon, and he did not see her again. The next day he looked for her all over Clarion, asked neighbors, even Miss Hart, but Sarah disappeared like smoke. Mary then cried for a week, and John just spat and said, "One less parasite." James was left alone. He was 19 and knew that the farm was not his life. He saved money by working part-time in a local store, and 2 years later he left for Chicago with one suitcase and $100 in his pocket. Left behind John, Mary, that damn corn, and the emptiness where Sarah should have been. But deep down he still heard her words, "Leave or you will rot." And he left. Emily Jones was born in the tidy maternity ward of a hospital in the Chicago suburb of Evanston on a bright morning in April 1988. Her father, Robert Jones, a famous orthopedic surgeon with golden hands and an even golden bank account, stood at the window of the room, looking at his newborn daughter with pride, like a general in his army. The mother, Linda Jones, lay in bed, tired but happy, with perfectly coiffed blonde locks that, even after giving birth, looked like she just stepped out of a salon. "She's going to be special," Linda said, stroking Emily's tiny hand, and Robert nodded, already imagining how this girl would become the centerpiece of their lives. The Jones family lived in a large house with columns and huge windows on the street, where every lawn was mowed to a ruler, and the neighbors' cars cost more than a year's teacher's salary. The house was 2 stories high, with white walls and a red tile roof, surrounded by rose bushes that Linda trimmed herself every spring. Inside, everything shone with cleanliness and prosperity. Marble floors in the hall, a crystal chandelier in the dining room, paintings in gilded frames on the walls. Emily grew up in this luxury, like a flower in a greenhouse, surrounded by care and attention. Her children's room was littered with toys, dolls, with porcelain faces, teddy bears, tiny tea sets, which Linda bought at a crossroads so that her daughter would not need for anything. Robert was a tall, fit man with thick dark hair and a look that could make any patient believe in a miracle. He was rarely home. Surgeries, conferences, endless calls from the hospital, but when he was, he brought Emily gifts: a dress with lace, hairpins with shiny stones, and once even a small white poodle puppy, which she named Pearl. Linda, on the other hand, was always there. Slim, with a soft voice and a habit of wearing pastel dresses, she devoted herself to her home and her daughter. She made apple pies, took Emily to dance lessons, and made sure she always looked perfect. "You are our princess," she said, combing her blonde hair, which became longer and thicker every year. By school, Emily already knew that she was not like others. Her first school uniform, a white blouse and a plaid skirt, was custom-made and not bought in a general store, like her classmates. At Evanston Elementary School, she quickly became the teacher's favorite. Neat notebooks, a clear voice during reading lessons, a smile that softened even the stern Mrs. Clark, the pursed-lipped math student. But her real life began in high school when she turned 14. Evanston High was huge, with long hallways, lockers along the walls, and a gym that always smelled of sweat and rubber. Here, Emily blossomed like a rose in June. She was tall for her age, with long legs and a small waist that was accentuated by tight jeans and crop tops, a 90s fashion she adored. Her hair, golden and shiny, fell in waves to the middle of her back, and she learned to style it so that it looked natural but perfect. She highlighted her eyes bright blue, like the summer sky, with mascara, which she secretly took from Linda. Emily knew she was beautiful and used it like a weapon. At the first meeting in the ninth grade, she entered the assembly hall, a little late, and all heads turned to her. The boys stared, the girls whispered, and she just smiled and walked to the empty seat as if the stage belonged to her. She was chosen for the cheerleading team at her first practice. The coach, Miss Reynolds, watched Emily do the splits and jump and said, "You were born for this." Emily loved the uniform red with white stripes, the short skirt that flew up with every movement, and the noise of the crowd when she waved pom-poms at football games. She became the star of the team, the one everyone looked to when the school band played the anthem. The guys from the football team, healthy, tanned, with broad shoulders, began to circle around her. One of them, Brian Miller, the captain, once waited for her after practice outside the locker room and offered her a ride home in his pickup truck. She agreed, although she knew Linda would grumble. That evening, he kissed her on the porch, and Emily realized that she could make any guy run after her like a dog. She was spoiled at home. Robert bought new shoes or earrings after every trip. Linda baked her cupcakes with cream, even if Emily complained about her figure. "You're perfect, honey," her mother answered, and Emily believed. At school, she gathered friends around her, the same bright, noisy girls like Caitlin Brown and Melissa Taylor, who admired her confidence and copied her gait. But Emily did not tolerate competition. When the new girl, Jessica Pierce, with dark hair and a soft voice, tried to take her place on the cheerleading team, Emily arranged for her to be caught smoking a cigarette in the school bathroom by slipping a pack into her bag and whispering to the coach. Jessica was kicked off the team, but Emily remained queen. By 16, she already knew what she wanted: attention, admiration, power. At her 10th grade prom, she was chosen as prom queen, wearing a backless silver dress. She stood on stage accepting the crown while the audience applauded. Brian, already her boyfriend, looked at her with adoration, and Caitlin and Melissa squealed with delight. Emily smiled, feeling on top of the world. She was used to everything revolving around her at home, at school, in this shiny little world of Evanston. And somewhere in the depths of her soul, she decided that it would always be like this. Morning burst into Emily Wilson's bedroom with soft light filtering through the white curtains. She woke up late, around 10, with a slight heaviness in her head. Yesterday's wine, which she and Michael drank after, had left its mark. The bed next to him was empty, the sheets were rumpled and still retained the warmth of his body. She stretched, feeling a pleasant ache in her muscles, and smiled, remembering how he held her close, whispering something in her ear. Michael left early as usual, throwing out a casual "see you" before slipping out the back door. Emily didn't mind, it was easier, safer. James rarely returned home before 8, absorbed in his work at the firm, and this gave her freedom. She stood up, throwing on an ivory silk robe that glided softly over her skin. Her hair, still disheveled from the night, fell over her shoulders, and she ran her hand through it, lazily planning to take a shower. The kitchen awaited her: downstairs, white marble countertops, a coffee machine that cost more than some earned in a month, and the silence of a large house. But when Emily walked down the stairs, barefoot, with the cold wooden steps under her feet, something made her freeze. On the floor, at the threshold of the bedroom, lay a bouquet of roses 12 red, with long stems, tied with a black ribbon. They were slightly crushed, as if they had been thrown in a hurry, and one petal came off, standing out like a scarlet spot on the light carpet. Emily frowned. She didn't remember Michael bringing flowers. He wasn't the type to bother with such things at all. His gifts were different. Quick glances, greedy hands, a stolen watch in her bed. Then where does it come from? She came closer, bent down, and picked up the bouquet. The thorns pricked her fingers, but she barely noticed. A thought swirled in her head, vague at first, and then more and more clear, like a cold wind that chilled her to the bones. James. He loved to give her roses, always red, always a dozen. And yesterday was the anniversary of their first meeting. 11 years old. She remembered how he once laughed as he said he was almost late for their first date because he was looking for the perfect bouquet. My heart beat faster. Emily looked around as if expecting to see him here in the hall, with that calm smile and tired eyes. But the house was empty. She rushed to the front door, opened it. The driveway was empty. His Ford was not parked in its usual place. Maybe he left flowers yesterday before leaving for work? No, it didn't add up. He always presented them personally, with some stupid comment like, "For my queen." And these were just lying there, abandoned like garbage. And suddenly she understood. He could be here, could see. Emily squeezed the bouquet until the stems crunched and ran back to the bedroom. She grabbed the phone from the nightstand, the white iPhone James had given her for her last birthday, and with trembling fingers dialed Michael's number. The beeps went on endlessly, each one seeming to hit her nerves. He finally answered, his voice low, slightly annoyed. What happened? Did you leave flowers? She blurted out without saying hello. The silence on the other end of the line stretched out, and she heard him clear his throat, as if trying to buy time. What flowers? What are you talking about? His tone was cold, almost indifferent, and it cut her more than she expected. Red roses. They were lying near the bedroom. Michael, tell me, isn't that you? Her voice broke on the last word, and she bit her lip to keep panic from escaping. No, Emily, I don't carry flowers around your house. It's probably your hubby who decided to pamper you. There was a hint of mockery in his words, and she imagined him sitting in his office, leaning back in his chair with that grin of his. Relax, everything is fine. What if he was here? If he saw? She walked around the room, clutching the phone until her knuckles turned white. Michael, this is not a joke. You left out the back door, but what if he? Listen, he interrupted, and there was a sharpness in his voice. I don't know what you were up to, but I don't have time right now. I have a meeting in 5 minutes. If James saw something, he would have made a scene for you by now, right? So calm down and don't call me for trifles. The connection was cut off, leaving her with beeps in her ear. Emily stared at the screen, feeling her stomach tighten. He hung up. He just took it and threw it away as if she were some kind of hysterical woman, and not a woman who would risk everything for him. She threw the phone on the bed and sank to the floor, still holding the bouquet. Her gaze darted around the room to the crumpled sheets, to the glass with the remains of wine on the nightstand, to the mirror where she was reflected, pale and disheveled. If James was here, if he saw her and Michael. She tried to remember last night, the sounds, the footsteps, anything but the memory was clouded by the wine and his hands on her body. Meanwhile, James Wilson sat in a cramped office on the outskirts of Chicago, a few miles from their home. The room smelled of old paper and coffee, the walls were covered with faded certificates, and at the table opposite him sat a man in a wrinkled shirt, Tom Crawford, a private detective. His stubble-covered face looked like he hadn't slept in a couple of days, but his eyes were sharp, tenacious. On the table lay a pack of cigarettes and a cup of black coffee, from which steam rose. So you want me to delve into your wife's life? Tom leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the table. It's not cheap, Wilson, and not quickly. James nodded, his face stony, but his hands clenched on his knees betrayed his tension. He could still feel the cold glass of the bottle of wine he was clutching, and the smell of roses, which now seemed sickening to him. "I need to know everything," he said quietly but firmly. "Who, where, for how long. Every detail." Tom narrowed his eyes as if sizing him up, then pulled the notebook out of the drawer. "Okay, let's start with the basics. Name, habits, places where she goes. The more you give, the faster I'll start." He clicked his pen, ready to take notes, and James took a deep breath as he began to speak. James Wilson sat in his office on the 17th floor of a skyscraper in downtown Chicago, looking out at the city through a huge window. The glass reflected his face tired, with dark circles under his eyes and a hard crease between his eyebrows that had appeared in recent days. There was a stack of papers on the table in front of him about a current case, some corporate dispute involving millions, but he couldn't bring himself to concentrate. His fingers nervously tapped the lacquered surface, and the same image was spinning in his head. Emily, her naked body under Michael, her moans that he heard standing in the doorway of their bedroom. That was 3 days ago, and since then he hasn't slept more than 3 hours a night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw this scene like a looping movie from which he could not escape. He only returned home once after that night, the next morning, when he was sure Emily had left for her yoga class. The bedroom still smelled of her perfume and something foreign, sharp, which he now associated with Michael. The bouquet of roses disappeared from the floor, but there was a mark on the carpet, a tiny red speck from a fallen petal. James then packed a bag with things, a couple of suits, shirts, underwear, and left for a hotel 2 blocks from the office. Emily called him twice, left messages asking where he was, why he didn't spend the night at home, but he didn't answer. Let him guess, he thought. Let him feel at least a drop of what he feels. This morning his phone vibrated on his desk. The number was unfamiliar, but he knew who it was. Tom Crawford, the private detective he met in that stuffy office on the outskirts. James picked up the phone, and Tom's voice, hoarse like after a pack of cigarettes, broke through the noise of the city outside the window. "Wilson, there's news. Meet me in an hour. Same place." James didn't have time to ask what exactly the connection was cut off. He got up, put on his jacket, and went down to the parking lot, where his black Ford was waiting like a faithful dog. Tom Crawford's office was in an old building with peeling paint and an elevator that creaked as if it was about to collapse. James walked up to the 3rd floor, his heels clicking on the worn steps. The door was slightly open, and the smell of coffee and tobacco could be heard from inside. Tom was sitting at a table littered with papers and empty fast food cups. He was wearing the same wrinkled shirt as last time, only now with a ketchup stain on the sleeve. There was a thin folder in front of him, tied with an elastic band, and he nodded to James, pointing to the chair opposite. "Sit down, Wilson." "I have a gift for you," Tom said, leaning back in his chair. His lips stretched into a crooked grin, revealing yellow teeth. James sat up, feeling his heart beat faster. He didn't know what to expect, but Tom's voice sounded like he had unearthed something serious. Tom untied the elastic and opened the folder. Photos lay on the table, black and white, grainy, clearly taken from afar through a telephoto lens. The first showed Emily getting out of Michael's car, a red BMW that James had seen in the company garage dozens of times. She was wearing dark glasses and a short dress, her hair flowing in the wind. On the second, they stood at the entrance to a building. Michael hugged her waist, and she laughed, throwing her head back. James clenched his fists until his nails dug into his palms. He knew they were together, but seeing it, their impudence, their closeness, was like a punch to the gut. "That's not all," said Tom, pulling out a piece of paper with printed text. "I've checked their movements over the past couple of months. Your wife and your boyfriend meet regularly. A hotel on Milwaukee Avenue, restaurants downtown, even a couple trips out of town. But here's what's interesting." He tapped his finger on the paper. "Their romance does not last a couple of weeks, as you thought. 2 years, Wilson. 2 fucking years." James froze. 2 years. 24 months of lies while he worked until midnight, signed contracts, paid for their house, her car, her damn clothes. He remembered how Emily began to stay more often with her friends, how she found reasons to go on weekends to her aunt in Milwaukee, whom he was now sure did not exist. For 2 years she slept with Michael behind his back, and he, like a fool, bought her roses and told her how beautiful she was. And this is not the end, Tom continued, rummaging through the folder. He pulled out another sheet, a bank statement. Michael Davis, your partner in the firm, spent a tidy sum on an apartment in the Loop. $150,000. Guess where the money comes from? Tom paused, looking at James with narrowed eyes. From your company, buddy. He siphoned them off through a fake account disguised as consulting expenses. The apartment is registered to a fictitious person, but I saw Emily go there. She even has a key. James felt the blood rush to his face and then drain away, leaving him cold. Apartment. They didn't just meet in hotels or at his house, they had their own nest, paid for with his money. He pictured them there, Michael lounging on the sofa, Emily pouring wine into glasses, laughing at what an idiot James was. His hands shook, and he hid them under the table so Tom wouldn't notice. You are sure? Jane's voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken for several hours. As in, the sun rises in the morning, Tom answered, shrugging his shoulders. He lit a cigarette, blowing smoke toward the ceiling. I have call records, photos, and statements. Do you want to hear her cooing to him on the phone? I have that too. No, James snapped. What he saw with his own eyes was enough for him. He leaned back in his chair, looking up at the ceiling, where old leaks stained yellow. 2 years. Apartment. Company money. Each fact was like a knife, cutting deeper, but instead of pain, he felt something else, icy clarity. Emily betrayed him. Michael betrayed him. And they both thought that he would never know. What's next? Tom asked, taking a drag from his cigarette. Do you want me to dig some more? Or will you file for divorce and sue them in court? James shook his head. Divorce? No, it's too simple. She will get away with half of his fortune, and Michael will remain with the company and that grin of his. They won't get off that easy. He looked at the photographs, at her smile, at his hand on her waist, and something dark, cold, hard grew inside him. He won't let them leave. He will destroy them slowly, methodically, so that they will regret that they were even born. Dig further, he said finally, standing up. I need everything. Every step, every dollar, every breath they take. He threw a wad of band notes on the table, the advance they had agreed upon, and went to the door. Tom nodded, putting out his cigarette in the overflowing ashtray. It will be done, he called after him, but James was no longer listening. He went down to the street, got into the car, and squeezed the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. They will pay, he thought. Both. James Wilson sat in his hotel room, looking out at the rain that beat on the window and blurred the lights of Chicago into hazy patches. The dim lamp on the nightstand cast a yellow light on his face, emphasizing the sharp lines of his cheekbones and the shadows under his eyes. He hadn't slept for the second night since Tom Crawford had told him the truth about Emily and Michael. He twirled a glass of whiskey in his hands cheap, from the minibar, but didn't drink, just watched the liquid sway, as if trying to find answers in it. His thoughts flew back to those times when everything was simpler, when he did not yet know what betrayal was. Back in the days when he first met Michael Davis. It was the fall of 2008, in a classroom at Northwestern University Law School. James was 22 at the time, having just arrived in Chicago with a suitcase full of dreams and a scholarship he had won through brains and stubbornness. He sat in the third row, wearing an old shirt with rolled-up sleeves and faded jeans that he bought back in Iowa for $10. In front of him lay a tattered textbook on contracts, covered in notes, and a cheap pen, which he chewed when he was nervous. The audience was buzzing, the voices of students, the rustling of papers, the creaking of chairs. Everyone around him seemed alien to him, children of rich parents with expensive watches and the confidence that comes with money. James felt like an outsider, a farm boy who had wandered into their world by accident. The door swung open, and he, Michael Davis, entered the audience. James still remembered what he looked like that day, tall, with broad shoulders, wearing a black leather jacket over a white shirt, unbuttoned at the top button. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, as if he had just climbed out of a sports car, and he had a smirk on his face that said, "I know you're all looking at me." He carried a brand new leather briefcase in his hands, casually throwing it over his shoulder, and headed straight for the empty seat next to James. Without asking, he plopped down on a chair and extended his hand. "Michael Davis," he said, looking at James with a slight squint, as if he was assessing him. The voice was low, confident, with a hint of something warm that immediately put you at ease. James shook hands. Michael's grip was tight, almost too strong, and muttered in response, "James Wilson." Michael nodded, as if the name meant something, and immediately pulled out a pack of gum from his pocket, offering it to him. James refused, and Michael shrugged, popping the record into his mouth. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, while the professor droned on about precedents at the blackboard. James tensed his accent. A slight hint of Iowa gave him away, but nodded. "Clarion. Small town. And you?" "Chicago, born and raised," Michael answered, grinning wider. "My old man, William Davis, may have heard. Banker. Owns half of the banks on the Loop." He said it so casually, as if he were talking about the weather, but James understood. This guy is from another world. The son of a banker, with money, connections, with a life that he, the son of farmers, could only dream of. The lesson dragged on slowly, but Michael did not stop talking. He whispered to James, commented to the professor, "Look, this old guy thinks we're here for his beard," and drew cartoons in his notebook. James was silent at first, but then relaxed. Michael was like a hurricane. He burst into your life and dragged you along with him, whether you wanted it or not. After the lecture, he tapped James on the shoulder and said, "Come on, let's have a snack. I'll treat you." They found themselves in a diner across the street from Campus Small, with sticky tables and the smell of frying potatoes. Michael ordered burgers and beer, although James tried to argue that he didn't have any extra money. "Forget it, it's on me." Michael waved it off, and James didn't argue. While they ate, Michael talked about himself, how he grew up in a huge house in the North Shore, how his father forced him to study so as not to disgrace the family, how he ran away from home to parties and returned in the morning. James listened, fascinated by this lightness, this confidence. He himself told a little about the farm, about John and Mary, about how he saved for his studies. Michael didn't laugh, as he feared, but nodded. "You made your way here on your own. That's cool, man." From that day on, they became inseparable. Michael was like a magnet. He attracted people with his charm, his jokes, his manner of speaking as if everything in the world belonged to him. He took James to parties in expensive bars where he would never go alone, introduced him to girls from rich families who had long legs and empty heads. James, with his quiet voice and habit of thinking before speaking, was the complete opposite, but Michael seemed to appreciate it. "You are my anchor, Wilson," he said, clapping him on the back after another drinking session. "Without you, I would already be lying in a ditch somewhere." They studied together, crammed in laws until midnight in the library, and shared notes. Michael was lazy, but damn smart. He could get through an exam with charisma alone, even if he didn't open the textbook. James worked like hell, knowing that he had no room for error. But Michael was always there, throwing up ideas, throwing in money for coffee, pulling him along with him. One day, in their second year, they got drunk in a bar after taking another exam, and Michael, drunk, put his arm around his shoulders. "You're like a brother, James," he said, looking into his eyes. "We are with you until the end, understand?" James nodded, feeling warmth in his chest. He believed. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had someone who cared about him. The years in law school flew by quickly. They graduated in 2011, both with diplomas and plans for the future. Michael immediately got a place in the company thanks to his father's connections, and James was trying to get through on his own. But Michael helped him. He put in a good word and pulled him out for an interview. They began working together, first as junior lawyers, then as partners, building their little empire. Michael was the face of the company's smile, handshakes, ability to talk any client down. James was the brains, the paperwork, the strategies, the endless hours at the desk. They complemented each other like two sides of a coin. Sitting in the hotel, James finished the whiskey in one gulp, feeling it burn his throat. He remembered that night in the bar, those words, like a brother. He trusted Michael more than anyone back then, more than your family, more than yourself. And now this brother slept with his wife, trampled him into the dirt, and laughed at him behind his back. James squeezed the glass until it almost cracked and placed it on the table. Friendship worth a million, he thought, and every penny now burned in his chest like acid. James Wilson turned the key in the lock of his house. It was about 6 in the evening. The sun was already setting towards the horizon, filling the street with orange light. After the night he found her with Michael, he couldn't bring himself to spend the night here, but he wasn't going to tell her the truth yet. Let him think that he is just busy with work, as always. The door opened with a slight creak, and a familiar scent filled his nostrils, her floral perfume mixed with the scent of the candles she liked to light in the living room. James gritted his teeth, kicking off his shoes at the threshold. The silence of the house seemed deceptive, almost alive, as if the walls knew what he had seen and were waiting for his next move. He walked through the hall, glancing at the kitchen. It was clean. There was no sign of last night's dinner. Only the coffee machine stood in its place, shiny and cold. Climbing the stairs, he was about to turn into the office when he heard rustling from the bedroom. The heart skipped a beat. He froze, gripping the railing so that the wood creaked under his fingers. Is she really at home? Or worse, is Michael here again, in his bed, in his house? James stepped towards the bedroom door, each step echoing with a dull knock in his chest. The door was slightly open, and through the crack he saw her. Emily was standing by the closet, in black leggings and a white t-shirt, with her hair tied up in a messy bun. She was rummaging through her drawer, pulling out a sweater, and didn't notice it. James exhaled, but the relief quickly gave way to something heavy and bitter. She looked so ordinary. It was as if nothing had happened. It was as if that night had never happened, those groans, that scene that now lived in his head like a parasite. James? Her voice came unexpectedly, and he realized that he had been standing in the doorway for too long. Emily turned, her blue eyes widening in surprise, but then softening into a smile. Are you home? I didn't hear you come in. He nodded, forcing himself to relax his face. Mask, James, he said to himself mentally. Keep her in place. I'm just getting things, he answered, his voice coming out a little hoarse, but evenly. Work has been running late, so I decided to drop by. Emily walked up to him, throwing her sweater on the bed. Her steps were light, almost dancing, and he noticed how she straightened her hair, as if she wanted to look better. You've been completely lost these last few days, she said, stopping a couple of steps away from him. I called and wrote. Everything is fine? James looked at her smooth skin, at the small scar above her eyebrow that she hated, at the lips that he had kissed 1,000 times, and everything he saw was ruined. These lips whispered Michael's name, these arms hugged him. He swallowed, resisting the urge to grab her shoulders and shake out the truth. Instead, he shrugged. Yes, it's just a mess at the company. Big deal. You know how it goes. She nodded, but something flashed in her eyes' doubt. Fear? Emily crossed her arms over her chest, tilting her head slightly. You could have warned me. I thought you were spending the night in the office again, but then I saw that your things were missing. Suits, shoes. She fell silent, looking at him more closely. Are you staying somewhere? At the hotel, he answered, without going into details. More convenient, closer to work. I didn't want to wake you up by coming back late. Every word was like a stone that he placed between them so that she wouldn't get closer. Emily frowned, but quickly hid it behind a smile. You could tell. I wouldn't be angry. She stepped towards him, reaching out to touch his shoulder, but James retreated, pretending to adjust the sleeve of his jacket. Her hand hung in the air, and he noticed how her fingers trembled. It's okay, Em, he said, looking into her eyes. I'm just tired. I'll go get what I need and come back. He walked past her to the closet, feeling her gaze at his back. Opening the door, he began to pull out Suit's dark blue gray, the one she chose for his birthday 2 years ago. Every rustle of fabric sounded louder than it should have in the silence between them. Emily stood by the bed, watching him. "You're strange today," she said finally, her voice becoming quieter, almost cautious. "Did something happen? At work? Or with me?" James froze, holding the hanger in his hands. He could tell her everything right now about that night, about the flowers, about how her moans still echoed in his ears. But he clenched his jaw and turned to her with a slight smile. "Nothing happened. Just exhausted. You know how I am when I'm tired." He lied so smoothly that he almost believed himself. She nodded but didn't look away. "Okay, but if something is wrong, tell me, okay? I'm your wife." She emphasized the last word as if checking his reaction. "Of course," he replied, putting the suits into a bag. "You are my wife." These words cut him like a knife, but he didn't show it. He pulled the zipper, picked up the bag, and went to the door. "See you later, Em." "James," she called, and he stopped without turning around. "You forgot to throw away your flowers. They wilted outside the bedroom. I removed them in the morning." He turned slowly, looking at her. Her face was calm, but there was a shadow in her eyes. Did she know he was there? Or were you just checking? "Thank you," he said dryly. "I didn't want them to go to waste." And he left, leaving her standing in the middle of the room. When he got into the car, his hands were shaking. The mask held on, but cracks had already appeared. She suspects something, he thought as he started the engine. But let him play his role for now. He will play on his own. James Wilson sat in his Ford parked on the side of a narrow street in an industrial area of Chicago. The rain drummed on the roof, leaving muddy streaks on the windshield, and the headlights of passing cars cast glare on his face. He had been waiting for Tom Crawford for 15 minutes, and his patience was beginning to crack at the seams. After their last meeting, the one where he learned about Emily and Michael's 2-year romance, and about the apartment bought with the company's money, James lived in some strange half-asleep. The days dragged on like rubber, filled with work, and the nights with whiskey and thoughts of how deeply he had been betrayed. But today Tom called again, and his voice on the phone sounded as if he had unearthed something that would either make James' heart stop or the plan in his head finally take shape. The headlights caught a figure in a long cloak walking across the road. Tom Crawford, hunched over in the rain, opened the passenger door and plopped down in the seat, shaking water from his hair. In his hands he clutched a worn folder, already familiar to James, only now it looked thicker. The car was filled with the smell of wet clothes and cigarette smoke, which trailed behind Tom like a trail. "You kept me waiting," James said without looking at him. His voice was even, but his fingers gripping the steering wheel betrayed his tension. "Rain, traffic jams, all this crap," Tom muttered, throwing the folder into James's lap. "But it's worth it, Wilson. Open it, you'll like it." James took the folder, feeling its wet weight. He untied the elastic and pulled out a stack of papers and photographs, illuminated by the dim light of the salon. The first thing that caught my eye was a photograph of Michael. He stood at the entrance to the bar, hugging a woman around the waist. But it wasn't Emily. She had dark hair, cut short, and a thinner figure than his wife. She laughed, throwing her head back, and Michael looked at her with the same smirk that James had seen hundreds of times, confident, almost possessive. "Who is this?" James asked, looking up at Tom. His voice trembled, but he immediately pulled himself together. Tom took a cigarette out of the pack, but didn't light it, just twirled it in his fingers. "Sarah Johnson, 28 years old, secretary at your company. Been working under your friend Michael for a year now. And apparently, he doesn't only type at his desk." James stared at the photo. Sarah Johnson. He vaguely remembered her. He saw her a couple of times in the office when he visited Michael. Thin, with sharp cheekbones, always in strict skirts, and with folders in her hands. She seemed invisible, one of those who disappears into the bustle of the company. And now here she is, in Michael's arms, with that smile, as if the whole world is at her feet. James felt something click inside him, like a mechanism that had long been waiting in the wings. "How long ago?" he asked, looking through the photographs. In one, Sarah and Michael were kissing in a car. In another, they were sitting in a cafe too close for colleagues. 6 months, maybe 7, Tom answered, shrugging his shoulders. I checked her calls, messages, even her bank account. Michael transfers money to her small amounts, but regularly. Gifts, dinners, all that romance. And at the same time, he continues to play with your Emily. The guy clearly isn't wasting any time. James squeezed the photo until the paper crumpled. 2 years with Emily, 6 months with Sarah. Michael, it turns out, is not just a traitor, he is also a greedy bastard who cannot be satisfied with one thing. James imagined him laughing at him in the office, telling his jokes to clients, and then running to one mistress, then to another, while he, James, worked to keep their company afloat. Bile rose in his throat, but he swallowed it, forcing himself to breathe evenly. Do they know about each other? He asked, looking at Tom. He shook his head. Don't think. Emily has never crossed paths with Sarah outside of the office, and Sarah doesn't seem to be aware that she's not the only one. Michael plays well, keeps them at a distance. Smart son of a bitch. James leaned back in his seat, looking at the ceiling of the car. The rain fell louder and louder, drowning out the noise of the city. Sarah Johnson, second lover. It was like a gift of fate, a crack in Michael's ideal life that he himself did not notice. James felt the corners of his lips twitch into a weak, cold smile. If Emily found out that she wasn't the only one, that her special one Michael was sharing his time and money with someone else, it would crush her. And Michael, he will lose control, begin to rush around, make mistakes. And James will be there to finish them both off. Where does she go? He asked, returning the pictures to the folder. Sarah, I need to know her habits. Tom pulled the notebook out of his inner coat pocket, flipping through the scribbled pages. Office, of course. Lives in a small apartment in the north of the city, rents. In the evenings he goes to the Riverside bar. It's a couple of blocks from the company. He loves cocktails and jazz, judging by how often he hangs out there. Sometimes Michael picks her up after work, but more often she is alone or with her friends. James nodded, remembering. Riverside. He'd been there a couple of times with Michael, a cramped place with wooden tables and live music that served decent bourbon. Sarah, then, loves jazz, and Emily loves the company's corporate parties noisy, with champagne and a bunch of familiar faces. And then it dawned on him. Collision. If he arranges for them to cross paths, Emily and Sarah in the same place, at the same time, then Michael's whole game will collapse on its own. Emily is not one to silently swallow humiliation, and Sarah, who knows how she will react, but that is no longer his concern. Take me another photo, he said, starting the engine. Sarah at the bar, with Michael, without him whatever you can, and the schedule of her trips there. I want to know when she is there. Tom narrowed his eyes, but nodded. It will be done. Are you up to something, Wilson? James didn't answer. He looked at the road, where the rain turned the asphalt into a black mirror. A plan was already forming in his head, simple, but accurate, like a shot. Sarah Johnson will be his trump card. He uses it to hit Emily, and through it, Michael. Let them know what it's like to have your life falling apart at the seams. He squeezed the clutch and drove off, leaving Tom in the rain with his cigarettes and questions. The car jerked forward, and James felt something hard and sharp begin to grow inside him. This was not just revenge, it was a war, and he just started playing. The dark hall of the Lakeview restaurant was buzzing with voices, the clinking of glasses and muffled laughter that spread through the air like expensive perfume. The light from crystal chandeliers reflected on the polished parquet floors, and waiters in black vests gilded among guests, carrying trays of champagne and tiny canapes. It was the firm's annual party, an event that Michael Davis and his partners threw for clients, employees, and those who wanted to show off in tuxedos and thousands of dollars worth of dresses. James Wilson stood at the bar, clutching a glass of bourbon that he had not yet drunk. His gaze scanned the crowd, picking out familiar faces, lawyers, accountants, clients with fat accounts, but he was looking for only two, Emily and Sarah. Today, he was going to throw a match into their perfect little world and watch it all catch fire. He spent a week planning this evening, Tom Crawford supplied him with Sarah's schedule. She loved Riverside, but rarely went to corporate parties, preferring to remain in the shadows. James knew that she would not refuse if the invitation came from Michael. He forged a message from his work number, nothing complicated. A couple of minutes with his phone left on the table in the office, and Sarah received a text. "I'll be glad to see you at the party on Friday. Come, it will be fun." She answered almost immediately, "Of course, Michael, I won't miss it." Emily was already going to be there. She loved these gatherings, where she could shine in a new dress and catch admiring glances. James himself reminded her of this in the morning, casually throwing over his shoulder, "Don't forget about the evening at Lakeview. Clients are waiting." She nodded, not even suspecting that he was pulling her into a trap. James straightened his tie black, formal, to match his mood, and took a sip of bourbon, feeling the warmth spreading through his chest. He looked as usual, a dark blue suit, an iron shirt, his hair neatly combed back. No one would say that something like cold rage was seething inside him. He noticed Emily first. She appeared at the door of the hall, like a queen at a ball, in a tight champagne-colored dress that flowed over her figure, emphasizing every curve. Her hair was styled in soft waves, and a diamond necklace glittered around her neck, a gift from him for their 5th anniversary. She smiled as she greeted her colleagues, and James felt his fingers tighten around the glass. Beautiful, deceitful, and soon broken. Sarah came in about 10 minutes later, and James almost missed her. She was not as flashy as Emily, a knee-length black dress, simple but elegant, dark hair pulled back into a low bun, minimal makeup. She looked nervous as she looked around until she spotted Michael at the far end of the hall. He stood with a group of clients, wearing his usual tuxedo, glass in hand, and that grin that could melt the ice. Sarah walked towards him and James followed, keeping his distance. He needed to push things forward, but quietly. He walked over to the snack counter, where Emily was chatting with two of the customers' wives, giggling about some nonsense. James caught her eye and nodded, faking a small smile. Have you seen Michael? One of the partners asked about him," he said, pretending that it was a random question. Emily turned around, her eyes sparkling, either from the champagne or from the mention of Michael. "He's out there somewhere, with clients, probably," she answered, waving her hand towards the hall. "Do you want me to find him?" "Yeah, that would be nice," James nodded, stepping back. "I'm busy with Johnson from Harris Corp. Tell him that they are waiting for him." He turned, hiding the coldness in his eyes, and walked away to a group of colleagues, knowing that she would go look for Michael. Everything went according to plan. Emily walked across the hall, her heels clicking on the parquet floor, attracting glances. She noticed Michael almost immediately. He was standing with his back to her, talking to Sarah. She whispered something in his ear, and he laughed, putting his hand on her waist. Emily slowed down, her smile faltering. She knew Michael too well. That gesture, that laugh, they were hers. She came closer, and then Sarah turned, her face lit up with a smile addressed to Michael. Emily stopped as if she had hit a wall. "Michael." Her voice was ringing, but with a hint of tension. He turned around, and for a second his grin disappeared, replaced by something like surprise. "Emily? What you?" "Who is this?" she interrupted, looking at Sarah. Her eyes narrowed, and the hand holding the glass trembled. Sarah frowned, taking a step back, but didn't leave. "This is Sarah," Michael said, quickly pulling himself together. He straightened up, his voice smooth as silk. "She works for us. Secretary. You probably saw her." "Secretary." Emily almost spat the word out, her gaze darting from his hand, still resting on Sarah's waist, to her face. "Is this how you shake hands with secretaries, or is this part of the job now?" The hall around them began to quiet down. People turned around and whispered, sensing a scandal. Michael removed his hand, but it was too late. Emily was already seething. "Are you serious, Michael? What is this, your new toy?" She stepped closer, her voice became louder. "How many of them do you have, huh? I thought we—" "Emily, that's enough," he snapped, his tone sharp as a blade. He looked around, noticing the glances, and took a step towards her, lowering his voice. "You're making a scene. Calm down." calm down." She laughed, but the laugh was bitter, almost hysterical. "You've been sleeping with me for 2 years, and now here she is. What is this, your plan? Keep us both on a leash?" Sarah turned pale, and her eyes widened. 2 years? She muttered, looking at Michael. "You said that I was the only one, that this was serious." Michael clenched his jaw, his face darkening. The crowd around froze, some even stopped breathing. James watched from afar, leaning against the counter, his pulse pounding in his temples. It was better than he expected. Emily tore their masks herself, even without his help. "You're both a mistake," Michael said, walking away from Sarah and looking at Emily with cold contempt. "You, especially, a past that I have long since outgrown. Stop creating a circus, go home." Emily froze, her face turning chalk white. The glass fell out of her hand and broke on the parquet floor. Champagne spilled across the floor. "The past?" she whispered, but he had already turned away, giving Sarah a quick "talk later" and walking off to the group of clients as if nothing had happened. Emily stood in the middle of the hall, alone, surrounded by whispers and glances. Her dress, her necklace, her perfect hairstyle, all of it now looked pathetic, like a costume on a doll that had been thrown away. Sarah walked towards the exit, giving her a look full of a mixture of anger and confusion. James finished his bourbon, feeling the warmth give way to icy satisfaction. The first crack has appeared. Now let him rush on. Emily Wilson stood at her bedroom window, looking out at the dark driveway where James Ford usually parked. The light from the street lamp reflected in the puddles left behind by the afternoon rain, casting a trembling glare on her face. She was still wearing the champagne dress she'd worn to the party at Lakeview, but now it hung on her like a crumpled rag, saturated with the smell of spilled wine and humiliation. Her hands trembled, clutching the windowsill, and fragments of what happened just a couple of hours ago were spinning in her head. Michael's words, "the past that I have outgrown," sounded in her ears like a broken record, and the glances of her colleagues, the whispers behind her, the clink of a broken glass still echoed in her chest. She lost everything she had built over the years in one moment, and now this moment was dragging her to the bottom. The party ended for her as soon as Michael turned away and walked away to the clients, leaving her standing in the middle of the room like discarded trash. She didn't remember how she got to the exit. Her legs themselves carried her through the crowd, past familiar faces that suddenly became strangers. Caitlin Brown, her friend from high school, turned away, pretending to straighten her dress. Jack Martin, one of the senior lawyers, cleared his throat and walked toward the bar to avoid meeting her gaze. Even the waiters seemed to look at her with pity as she looked for her purse and ran outside. In the car, while the taxi was taking her home, she sat, staring out the window, and felt like her ideal world was coming apart at the seams. The phone in the bag was silent, no calls, no messages. No one wrote to ask if everything was okay. No one wanted to get involved with a woman who was publicly called a past. The house was quiet, too quiet. "James hasn't returned yet. He said in the morning that he would be in the office after the party, and she wasn't even surprised. In recent days, he had been cold and distant, but she chalked it up to work. Now, standing in the empty bedroom, she began to doubt. The bouquet of roses that she found on the doorstep resurfaced in her memory. He was there the night Michael stayed with her. She had thrown the flowers away, convincing herself that it was an accident, that James had simply forgotten to pick them up. But now the thought was gnawing at her like a rat. What if he saw? What if he knows? Emily tore the necklace from her neck and tossed it onto the dresser, where it clanged as it hit the mirror. She walked over to the bed, sat down on the edge, and hid her face in her hands. Her fingers still smelled like champagne, sticky and sour, and she clenched them into fists, trying to stop the trembling. Michael. This bastard. For 2 years she believed him, gave herself to him, risked everything for his words, his hands, his promises that they were something more. And he slept with some secretary Sarah, this skinny girl with a sharp look, who stood next to him like a mistress. And he called her, Emily, a mistake. In front of everyone, before her world. She stood up, walked to the closet, and pulled out a bottle of wine from her stash Pinot Noir. which she had hidden from James because he always grumbled that she drank too much. Opening it with trembling hands, she poured a full glass and drank half of it in one gulp, feeling the warmth spreading down her throat. She needed to drown out this noise in her head, this pain that burned her from the inside. But the wine did not help, it only intensified the taste of humiliation that remained after Michael's words. The headlights flickered across the window, and Emily flinched. She heard the car door slam, and the front door creaked. James. She put the glass on the nightstand, wiped her lips with the back of her hand, and quickly straightened her hair, trying to tidy herself up. He shouldn't see her like this, broken, confused. She can still fix everything, convince him that nothing bad happened. If he doesn't know about Michael, then he can still be saved. James entered the bedroom a couple of minutes later, his steps heavy and tired. He was wearing the same suit he had worn at the party, dark blue, with the jacket slightly rumpled, and his face looked exhausted but calm. Too calm. He glanced at her, then at the glass of wine, but said nothing. He simply nodded as if it were a normal evening. "You're early," Emily said, making her voice sound light. She stood up, crossing her arms over her chest to hide her trembling. "I thought you'd be late with clients." "I finished early," he replied, taking off his jacket and hanging it over the back of his chair. His movements were measured, almost mechanical. "How are you?" The party seemed noisy. Emily swallowed. He was there, saw her, but didn't come over. "Why?" She stepped towards him, trying to catch his eye. "Yes, it was. Fun. There are a lot of people. Everything is as usual. Where have you been? I hardly saw you." James shrugged, unbuttoning the top button of his shirt. "I spoke with Johnson from Harris Corp. Then I got stuck with the accountants. Nothing interesting." He finally looked at her, and there was not a shadow of suspicion in his eyes, only fatigue. Or was he just that good at pretending? She nodded, feeling her stomach tighten. She needed to say something, to see if he knew. "There was a small incident," she began carefully, looking at his reaction. "I had a little argument with Michael. It was stupid. Everyone went too far with champagne." James raised an eyebrow, but his face remained expressionless. "With Michael? Because of what?" His tone was even, almost indifferent, as if he really didn't care. Emily hesitated, fiddling with the hem of her dress. "Yes, nonsense, work issues. He was rude. I lost my temper. Everyone stared at me like I was stupid." She laughed, but the laugh came out strained and brittle. "I guess I went too far." "It happens," James said, sitting on the edge of the bed and taking off his shoes. "Michael sometimes goes too far. You know what he's like." He threw his shoes into the corner and leaned back, looking at the ceiling. "The main thing is that clients are happy. Nothing else matters." She looked at him, trying to figure out if he was faking it. He acted as if he had not noticed anything, as if he had not heard her screams, did not see how she stood in the middle of the hall, humiliated and crushed. But the longer he was silent, the more guilt gnawed at her. If he doesn't know, then she's still lying to him every day with every word. And if he knows... Emily clenched her fists, suppressing the urge to scream. "James," she said quietly, sitting down next to him. I didn't want it to turn out like this. You're not mad at me, are you?" He turned his head, looking at her with a slight smile. "For what? Because you had a fight with Michael. It's not my problem, Em." He stretched as if to get up, but she grabbed his arm. "No, I want you to know that I appreciate you. You're always there, even when I act stupid." Her voice trembled, her eyes shone with tears that she tried to hold back. James looked at her hand, then at her face. "You are my wife," he said simply, but there was no warmth in his voice, only a cold statement. "I'm always there." He gently released his hand and stood up, heading towards the closet. "I'll go take a shower. Long day." Emily remained seated, looking after him. His indifference cut her more than if he had shouted. She wiped away her tears, feeling guilt and fear mixing inside her like poison. "He doesn't know," she repeated to herself. But why then did it seem to her that he was looking at her as if she were a stranger? James Wilson sat at the desk in his home office, surrounded by silence, broken only by the quiet hum of his laptop. The light from the table lamp fell on his face, highlighting the sharp shadows under his eyes and the hard line of his compressed lips. On the table in front of him were printouts of bank statements, old letters, and a stack of documents he had collected over the past few days. This was his arsenal, invisible but deadly. After the party at Lakeview, he watched as Emily began to come apart at the seams, as her perfect mask showed its first serious crack. But this was not enough. Humiliation in front of colleagues is only the first blow. Now he was going to strike where she felt invulnerable: her reputation, her little holy world of charity. Emily had been running the Heart of Chicago Foundation for 3 years, a project she created to help kids from poor families, as she liked to say at every dinner with friends. James knew that this was more of her toy than a real mission. Luxurious gala evenings, photos in glossy magazines, praise from friends. But the fund brought in money donations from wealthy sponsors, whom she knew how to charm with her smile and beautiful speeches. And now this money has become his weapon. He opened his laptop and downloaded a file that he had received from a hacker he knew, a guy named Danny, whom he had met a couple of years ago on one of the company's cases. Danny was skinny, had greasy hair, and a nail-biting habit, but his fingers worked wonders with a code. For $1,000 and a promise not to ask questions, he hacked into the Foundation's server and gave James full access to financial records. James spent 2 days studying them: transfers, bills, donations. Everything looked clean, too clean for an organization run by Emily, who didn't bother with the details. But among those perfect numbers, he found what he was looking for: an account associated with Michael's apartment in the Loop. Tom Crawford has already discovered that Michael bought this apartment with the company's money, disguising it as consulting services. But James decided to go further. He reached out to another contact, an accountant named Richard Kane, an old friend from law school, who agreed to help him fix the papers for a couple of hundred. Richard was bald, with a perpetually red face and a habit of sweating even when it was cold, but he knew how to make numbers tell any story. James handed him the data: fund statements, fake receipts, and a few emails he'd concocted himself on Emily's old laptop while she was in the shower a couple of weeks ago. The letters looked like she was giving instructions to transfer the fund's money to an account connected to Michael's apartment. Urgently transfer 50,000 to this account. It's for the project. One of them read, signed Emily Wilson, and her work email. Richard processed everything overnight, adding several false transactions to the fund report, small but noticeable if anyone started digging. The amounts went into the same account as Michael's firm's money, creating the illusion that Emily had been stealing from the fund for years to finance her secret life. James even slipped in a couple of checks with her signature, real ones, from last year's office expenses, twisting the dates and appointments. Everything looked perfect. Even he himself, a lawyer with 10 years of experience, would not have found holes in this scheme. The next step was to start a rumor. James knew how gossip worked in their circle. He called Lisa Marshall, a journalist from the Chicago Tribune whom he had once met at a charity dinner. Lisa was short, with a sharp nose and a habit of writing down everything that was said, even in casual conversation. He met her in a cafe on the corner, away from prying eyes, and under the guise of casual chat, dropped a hint: "I heard that Heart of Chicago is having some financial problems. It's a shame if it's true Emily has put so much effort into it." Lisa's ears perked up like a hound, and 2 days later she called him with the question: "James, do you know something? I have a source who talks about fraud." He pretended to be surprised, advised me to check the reports, and hung up. On Wednesday morning, 4 days after the party, the scandal broke out. James sat in his hotel, drinking coffee from a cheap mug and flipping through the latest issue of the Tribune on his tablet. The headline on the front page read, "Charity Under Suspicion. Emily Wilson Linked to Embezzlement." The article was short but poisonous. An anonymous source reported dubious transfers amounting to more than $100,000 going into personal accounts. Emily's name was mentioned 3 times, along with the phrase, "possible breach of trust." By lunchtime, the news was picked up by local TV stations. A report on WGN showed a photo of her from last year's gala, where she was smiling in a red dress, and a voiceover said, "A woman known for her philanthropy is at the center of a financial scandal." James turned off the TV and leaned back in his chair, feeling cold satisfaction flow through his veins. He knew that Emily was now at home, alone, watching the same news and probably tearing her hair out. Her phone is most likely buzzing with calls, friends, sponsors, colleagues from the foundation, and everyone wants to know if this is true. He imagined her face pale, with red stains from tears, her perfect hair in disarray, her voice trembling as she tried to justify herself. This was just the beginning. In the evening, he decided to stop by home, ostensibly to get documents, but actually to see her. He parked at the house, entered through the back door, and heard her voice from the living room. She was talking on the phone, almost shouting, "It's a lie, Caitlin. I didn't take anything. It's some kind of mistake." Silence, then a sob. "You don't believe me? After everything." The phone slammed onto the table and Emily burst into tears. James stepped into the living room, pretending that he had just arrived. She was sitting on the sofa, wearing an old t-shirt and jeans, with smeared mascara under her eyes. Seeing him, she jumped up, wiping her face with her sleeve. "James, did you see?" Her voice was hoarse, broken. "They say I stole money from the fund." "This is not true." He nodded, placing his bag on the floor. "Saw, in the morning on the news. What's happening?" His tone was flat, slightly puzzled, as if he really didn't understand. "I don't know." She stepped towards him, grabbing his hand. "Someone framed me. These are some fake reports. I would never. You know how much I worked on this fund." Her eyes were shining with tears, and she clung to him like a life preserver. James looked down at her, feeling her fingers tremble. "Calm down, Em. If this is a mistake, we'll figure it out. Do you have a lawyer?" He gently released his hand, as if about to pour water, and walked towards the kitchen. "Not yet. I don't know where to start." She followed him, fiddling with the hem of her t-shirt. "James, do you believe me? Say you believe." He turned, holding the glass in his hands, and looked into her eyes. "You are my wife, Emily. Of course I believe you." The lie rolled off his tongue so easily that he was surprised. "We will find who did this." She nodded, wiping away tears, but there was something else in her gaze: fear, guilt, confusion. James turned away, hiding his cold smile. "The media have already begun their work. Now let it burn further." Emily Wilson stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the empty driveway where, just a week ago, her white Mercedes gleamed in the morning sun. Now the car was in the garage, covered with a thin layer of dust. It had not left the house since the scandal with the fund flared up in full force. The morning light made its way through the curtains, but it seemed gray and dull to her, as if the sun itself had decided to turn away from her. On the table in front of her lay the phone, the screen of which had been silent for the second day. No calls, no messages, only rare notifications from news applications that she had long stopped opening. The last headline she saw was from the Chicago Sun-Times. "Emily Wilson quit Heart of Chicago amid accusations." "Leaves." The word sounded like a mockery. She was kicked out, pushed out, like a dog that had chewed its leash. It all started right after the Tribune article. The day after news of the dubious transfers spread around town, she received a call from Margaret Klein, chairwoman of the foundation's board. Margaret was a woman of about 60, with gray hair always styled in a severe bun and a voice that could cut glass. Emily knew her as strict but fair. Together, they organized dozens of events and raised millions for children. But that day, Margaret's voice was icy, devoid of even a hint of warmth. "Emily, we've called an emergency council meeting," she said without preamble. "In light of these accusations, we cannot risk the reputation of the foundation. You must leave. Today." Emily tried to argue, her voice shaking as she babbled about the mistake, the setup, the fact that she never took a penny. "Margaret, you know me. I wouldn't. It's someone else. I'll prove it." But Margaret cut her off. "Prove it in court, if it comes to it. In the meantime, we are forced to distance ourselves. The decision is final." The line went silent, and Emily was left standing in the middle of the living room, clutching the phone until it nearly cracked. She was thrown out. 3 years of work, hundreds of hours, all those smiles and handshakes all erased overnight. She rushed to call a lawyer, an old acquaintance of James, Paul Richards, who once helped her with an agreement for the fund. Paul was a balding man with round glasses and a habit of speaking slowly, as if every word cost him effort. She dumped everything on him about the articles, about the advice, about the fact that she was framed. He listened, paused, and then said, "Emily, this is serious. They have extracts, signatures, and letters. Even if it's a fake, it will be difficult to prove. It's better to leave quietly before the investigation begins." She hung up the phone, feeling the floor disappear from under her feet. Even Paul, the man she trusted, looked at her as if she were guilty. Friends disappeared faster than work. Caitlin Brown, her friend from high school, the one who squealed with delight when Emily was chosen prom queen, stopped answering her calls after the party at Lakeview. Emily wrote to her the day after the article, begging her to meet. "Kate, this is not true. I need your support." The answer came a day later, short and dry. "Sorry, Em, now is not the best time. I have children, work, you understand." Emily reread the message 3 times, feeling tears sting her eyes. Caitlin, who had vowed to be with her until the end, dropped her like a hot potato. Melissa Taylor, her other best friend, the one who loved to gossip over a glass of wine, called herself, but only to confirm the rumors. Is this true? Did you really take the money? I'm just shocked." Her voice was full of feigned sympathy, but Emily heard hidden curiosity, almost gloating. "No, Mel, that's a lie," she shouted, but Melissa quickly ended the conversation. "Oh, okay, I believe you, but you know, now everyone is saying, 'I'll call you later.'" Later never came. Social media has become a minefield. Her Instagram page, which until recently featured photos from galas and smiling selfies with James, was now empty. She deleted everything after strangers filled the comments. "Thief, shame of Chicago, how do you sleep with that kind of money?" Even those whom she considered distant acquaintances unfollowed or simply became quiet. Her world, which she had been building for years from likes, smiles, statuses, collapsed, leaving only an echoing emptiness. Emily turned away from the window and walked to the sofa, where there was a stack of newspapers that she had not had time to throw away. The latest edition of the Tribune was on top, with her photo on the front page, a photo from a charity dinner where she was in a red dress, with a glass in her hand and that perfect smile of hers. The captain now read, "Emily Wilson, from philanthropist to suspect." She grabbed the newspaper, crumpled it, and threw it into the corner, but it didn't help. Her name was everywhere in the news, in conversations, in this damned silence at home. She poured herself some wine, the same Pinot Noir she drank the night before, and collapsed onto the sofa, pulling her knees to her chest. The glass shook in her hand as she took a sip, a second, a third. It seemed to her that she was drowning not in wine, but in this loneliness that crashed over her like a wave. She tried to remember the last time she spoke to someone other than James. Yesterday? Day before yesterday. Even he, her husband, was distant. He came home late, spoke little, looked at her with this strange mixture of fatigue and something that she could not decipher. But he believed her, and said he believed her. It was the only thing she still clung to. Emily put her glass on the table and picked up her phone, scrolling through her contacts. She settled on Linda's number, her mother. They didn't speak for a couple of months. Linda lived in Evanston, in the same house where Emily grew up, and was always grumbling that her daughter rarely called. Emily dialed the number, listening to the long beeps. Finally, the mother answered, her voice soft but wary. "Emily, is something wrong?" "Mom," she began, and her voice broke. "Have you seen the news? About me, about the foundation?" The silence on the other end of the line was long, too long. "I saw it," Linda said finally. "Your father, too. We didn't know what to think. This is true?" "No," Emily almost shouted, jumping up from the sofa. "It's a lie, Mom. I didn't steal anything. I was framed, I don't know who, but—" "Okay, honey, calm down," Linda interrupted, but there was no previous warmth in her tone. My father and I are just worried. Do you understand what this looks like? People call and ask. We're ashamed, Emily. Ashamed. She froze, feeling tears burning her eyes. You don't believe me. We want to believe, Linda answered quietly, but you have to figure it out yourself. Call me when everything calms down, and hung up. Emily threw the phone on the sofa, choking on tears. Even her mother, even her own family, turned away. She was left alone without work, without friends, without this crown that she had worn all her life. The high school queen, the party queen, the foundation queen all gone, leaving only a woman in a wrinkled t-shirt, an empty glass, and smeared mascara. She fell to her knees, buried her face in her hands, and began to cry loudly, hysterically, like a child abandoned in the dark. James Wilson walked down a rain-soaked street on Chicago's north side, clutching a paper cup of coffee he just bought at a corner diner. The air smelled of dampness and exhaust, and the wind blew scraps of newspaper and plastic bags along the sidewalk. He hadn't planned to end up here, he was just driving from the office when the car died 2 blocks away, and while the mechanic was digging under the hood, James decided to stretch his legs. His boots clattered on the asphalt, leaving dark footprints, and his head was filled with thoughts about the last step of his plan. Emily was already drowning in the scandal with the foundation, and he was waiting for her to finally collapse. But something was aching in him, some old splinter that he could not pull out. He turned the corner and noticed a sign for the Blues Cafe, a small establishment with peeling paint on the frames and dim light pouring from the windows. James pushed the door open, deciding to wait out the rain with a cup of something hot. It was warm inside and smelled of frying bacon and old wood. Several tables were empty, with only a couple of old men drinking coffee in the corner and the bartender wiping down the counter behind the counter. James was about to sit by the window when his gaze fell on the woman at the table in the far corner. She sat alone, a cup of tea and an open book stood in front of her, and her dark hair, cut short, fell over her forehead while she underlined something with a pencil. Sarah Johnson, Michael's secretary, his involuntary trump card. James froze, feeling the coffee in his hand begin to burn his fingers. He hadn't seen her since the Lakeview party where she ran into Emily, and Tom hadn't mentioned her in his reports since. But something about her, the way she sat, slightly hunched over, the way she held the pencil struck him like an old memory. He stepped closer, not knowing why, and coughed to get her attention. Sarah looked up, her gray eyes narrowing as she recognized him. "Mr. Wilson," she said, putting down her pencil. The voice was low, with a slight hoarseness, as if she had recently cried or smoked. "What are you doing here?" "I'm drinking coffee," he answered, raising his glass. "And you? I didn't think I'd see you in such a hole." She grinned, but not amusedly, and nodded to the chair opposite. "Sit down if you want. I don't bite. Bye." James sat down, putting his coffee on the table. He looked at her, trying to understand what she was doing here, alone, with this book, The Grapes of Wrath, a tattered volume that he himself read at school. "I didn't know you loved Steinbeck," he said, just to start a conversation. "You don't know a lot about me," she answered, closing the book. "This is not about work, if anything. I just read when my head is buzzing. And you? Why did you come? Watching me like your detective." He narrowed his eyes, but showed no surprise. "Do you know about Tom?" "I'm not stupid, James." She leaned closer, her voice becoming quieter. "I saw him with a camera a couple of times. At first I thought it was Michael testing me, but then I realized it was you. Why do you need me? I've already left this game." James took a sip of coffee, buying time. "You were with Michael. It makes you useful, but I didn't know that you—" He hesitated, looking at her face. These eyes, this look, he had seen them before, not in the office, but somewhere deeper in the past. "What?" Sarah frowned, leaning back. "Negotiate." "You look like someone," he said slowly. "To my sister, Sarah Wilson. She left home at 16. For a long time." She froze, her fingers clenching the cup until her knuckles turned white. The silence hung between them, heavy as a wet raincoat. Finally, she exhaled, almost laughing. "Are you serious?" James Wilson from Clarion. Damn, I thought you forgot about me a long time ago. He stared at her, feeling the ground disappear from under his feet. Sarah, is it you? Who else? She brushed her hair back from her face, and now he saw the same cheekbones, the same stubborn chin as the girl who ran away from their farmhouse 15 years ago. I changed my last name to Johnson when I left. I didn't want the old man to find me. But you are here, sitting in front of me like a ghost. Why didn't you tell me? His voice trembled, and he clenched his fists under the table. You worked at my company, slept with Michael, and I didn't even know it was you. What would you do? Hugged me and said, "Welcome home?" She shook her head. I escaped that life, James. From John, from Mary, from this farm. I came here, studied, and got a job in your office. I didn't know you were there until I saw you with Michael, and I decided to remain silent. You were a big shot, and I was just a secretary. James looked at her, trying to put the pieces together. You knew who I was and still went to bed with him? I didn't know about Emily, she snapped. Michael was. He was good to me. He said that I was special. And then this party, and I realized that he was lying. For both you and me. He betrayed us both, James said quietly, looking into her eyes. You saw what he did to Emily that evening. And now I do the same to her. Sarah narrowed her eyes. Are you talking about the fund? This is what you're doing, right? I heard her crying on the phone with someone. You're drowning her. She deserved it, he answered coldly. 2 years with Michael behind me. Do you think she's innocent? No, Sarah shook her head. But Michael is the main bastard here. He played with both of us. I want him to pay. And you, it seems, too. James nodded, feeling old wounds open, but with them came something new, an ally. Are you proposing to unite? Why not? She leaned closer. Her voice became firmer. I know his weaknesses. He is talkative when he drinks, bragging about his bills and clients to me. I have notes, not everything, but enough. And you have the brains and money to finish it off. We can crush it together, and Emily too, if you want. Why do you need this? He asked, looking into her eyes. You could have just left. Because he ruined my life, she said, and her voice wavered. I loved him, James, and he called me a mistake in front of everyone. I want him to feel the same way, the emptiness, the shame. You understand? I understand, he replied, remembering that night with a bouquet of roses. Better than you think. Sarah nodded, finishing her tea. Then decide, I'm with you, brother. But it won't be family-friendly. It will be messy. James extended his hand across the table, and she shook it, firmly, as in childhood, when they swore to each other to escape from Clarion. Dirty suits me, he said. Welcome back, Sarah. Emily Wilson stood in front of the bathroom mirror, trying to get herself ready for the worst day of her life. Her hands shook as she applied a thin layer of foundation to hide the dark circles under her eyes and the red stains from tears that hadn't dried in a week. Her hair, once her pride long, golden, shiny, now hung in dull strands, and she gathered it into a strict bun, securing it with hairpins so tightly that the skin on her head prickled. She put on a gray suit, a pencil skirt, and jacket, bought back in the days when such things seemed to her a symbol of confidence. Now they sat on her like someone else's skin, emphasizing her thinness and stoop. Today she was summoned to court. Not just an interrogation, not just a conversation with a lawyer, a real hearing where her life will be smeared in front of the judge, the jury, and anyone who wants to watch. It all started with the summons she was handed 3 days ago. She was sitting in the kitchen, staring at her empty cup of coffee when the doorbell rang. The postman, a young guy with tired eyes, handed her an envelope and left without even looking at her twice. Emily opened it with trembling fingers and read, Emily Wilson, you are summoned to appear in Chicago District Court on charges of fraud and embezzlement from the Heart of Chicago Foundation. Date, time, signature of the prosecutor. Her heart sank to her feet, and she collapsed into a chair, clutching the paper until it crumpled. This was not just a rumor, not gossip in the newspapers. It became a reality, cold and heavy, like the handcuffs she saw in the films. She called Paul Richards, her lawyer, right away. His voice on the phone was as slow and measured as always, but now there was tension in it. "Emily, they collected evidence," he said, clearing his throat. "Bank statements, letters with your signature, transfers to the account connected to the apartment in Lupa. It looks bad. Very bad." She screamed into the phone. "It's not me. I didn't sign anything. I didn't translate anything." But Paul just sighed. "Someone did it for you. And they did it damn well. We need to prepare." Emily looked at herself in the mirror, feeling the tears sting her eyes again. She wiped them away with her sleeve, smearing her mascara, and clenched her jaw. She needs to hold on. Today she must leave the house, get into a taxi, walk through a crowd of journalists who are probably already waiting outside the court, and sit in the courtroom while she is tried for something she did not do. But deep down she knew that the evidence against her was ironclad. Paul had shown her copies the day before, fund statements with her name on them, transfers to an account she had never seen, emails sent from her work email. One of them, dated last year, read, "Transfer 50,000 to this account, urgently. For the project, Emily W." The signature was hers, an exact copy, right down to the curl on the W. She looked at these papers until the letters began to blur before her eyes, and whispered, "This is not me. This is not me." But who will believe her? The taxi arrived at the house at 8 in the morning. Emily walked out, clutching her purse until her nails dug into her palms. The street was empty, but she could feel the looks of her neighbors, who were probably watching from behind the curtains, discussing her fall over their morning coffee. The driver, an elderly man with a thick mustache, glanced at her briefly in the rearview mirror, but said nothing. She gave the address of the court, and the car drove off, taking her towards the nightmare. The Chicago County Courthouse loomed over the street like a stone monster gray, with columns and wide steps leading up to the entrance. Emily got out of the taxi and was immediately blinded by camera flashes. The journalists attacked like a pack of wolves, their cries mixed into a roar. "Mrs. Wilson, is this really about embezzlement? What do you say to the fund sponsors? Where is the money, Emily?" She raised her hand to cover her face and pushed through the crowd, feeling someone push her on the shoulder. The guard at the entrance silently opened the door to let her in, and she collapsed on a bench in the hall, gasping for breath. The courtroom was cold, with high ceilings and rows of wooden benches that creaked under the weight of people. Emily sat next to Paul, her fingers fiddling with the hem of her skirt, while the prosecutor, a tall man with a sharp chin and cold eyes, laid out papers on the table. The judge, an elderly woman with gray hair and a stern face, entered the courtroom, and everyone stood up. Emily stood up on wobbly legs, feeling the judge's gaze sliding over her like a spotlight. "Case number 25104, State of Illinois v. Emily Wilson," the secretary announced, and Emily flinched when she heard her name spoken as formally as a sentence. The prosecutor stood up, straightening his tie, and began to speak. "Your Honor, this is a case of gross fraud committed by the defendant, Emily Wilson, between January 2023 and September 2024. She, as director of the Heart of Chicago charity, systematically transferred funds intended to help children into a personal account associated with the purchase of real estate in the Loop area. We have evidence, bank statements, emails, documents she signed. The total amount of damage is $147,000. Emily listened, feeling the blood run cold in her veins. She turned to Paul, whispering, "It's not true, tell them." But he only put his hand on her shoulder, whispering in response, "Quiet, Emily, we will leave later." The prosecutor walked over to the evidence table and picked up a folder. Here is an extract dated March 15, 2023. Transfer of $50,000 to an account registered to Loop Properties. And here is a letter sent from Mrs. Wilson's personal email indicating this transfer. The signature has been verified by an expert and is genuine. Emily looked at the papers he showed the judge and felt the walls of the courtroom closing in around her. It was her signature, her email, her name, but she didn't do it. She wanted to scream, rush to the table, tear these sheets, but her legs did not move. Paul stood up when it was his turn to speak and began, "Your Honor, my client denies all charges. These documents may have been forged. We require an independent examination." But his voice sounded weak, uncertain, and Emily saw the judge shaking his head as if he had already decided everything. The hearing dragged on for hours. The prosecutor called witnesses, the fund's accountant, who confirmed the strange transfers, the sponsor, who said that trust had been undermined. Emily sat looking at the floor, feeling like each new voice was driving a nail into her coffin. She was in despair. No one believed her. Even Paul seemed to have doubts. When the judge called a break, she remained seated, staring at her hands, which now seemed foreign. "Emily," Paul said quietly, sitting down next to her, "we need to prepare for the worst. If they prove a connection with this apartment, it's not me." She threw her head up, her voice breaking into a scream. "Whose apartment is this?" "I don't know her," he sighed, looking away. "The account is associated with Michael Davis. To your acquaintances." Emily froze, her eyes widening. Michael, apartment, money. Everything came together into one terrible picture, and she realized that this was the end. She buried her face in her hands, choking on tears as the hall emptied around her. Judgment Day came, and he left her no chance. James Wilson pushed open the door of his house, no longer his own, to be honest, and stepped into the empty hallway. The sound of his footsteps echoed off the bare walls where paintings and photographs of his and Emily's happy life had previously hung. He moved his things out a week ago while she sat in court, dealing with the charges that he himself had brought against her. Now the house looked like a skeleton. The furniture was still there, but without his books, clothes, that stupid coffee maker he bought in the first year of marriage, it was all just a dead shell. He came here not for something forgotten, but to finish what he started. Today, Emily learns the truth, and let him choke on it. He heard her even before he entered the living room, quiet sobs, interrupted by the rustling of fabric, as if she were rubbing her face with her sleeve. Emily sat hunched over on the couch, wearing the same wrinkled t-shirt he'd seen her in last time, with disheveled hair and an empty glass in her hand. There was a bottle of wine on the table, almost empty, with crumpled napkins lying nearby. She looked up as he entered, and her blue eyes, red from crying, widened in surprise. "James," her voice was hoarse, cracked, like old glass. Are you back?" He stopped in the doorway, crossing his arms over his chest. "Not really, Em. I came to talk." She jumped up, almost knocking over the bottle, and stepped towards him, fiddling with the hem of his t-shirt. "Oh my God, James, I'm so glad you're here. You have no idea what's happening to me. The trial, these damn charges, everyone thinks I'm a thief." She fell silent, looking at him, searching his face for at least a drop of sympathy. But his eyes were cold as ice, and she hesitated. You believe me, right?" James grinned shortly, bitterly, without a trace of warmth. "Should I believe you? Are you serious to me now, Emily?" She frowned, taking a step back. "What do you mean? I told you, it's not me, it's some kind of setup." "Stop lying," he barked, and she flinched as if from a blow. He stepped closer, his voice became lower, but sharper, like a knife. "I know everything, Em. All. About you and Michael. For 2 fucking years you had sex with him behind my back. In our bed, in our home. Do you think I'm blind? Do you think I didn't see you moaning underneath him while I stood in the doorway with those damn roses?" Emily turned pale, her mouth opened slightly, but the words were stuck in her throat. She shook her head, weakly, as if she could dismiss the truth. "No, no, James, you don't understand. It wasn't like that." "Isn't that right?" he almost shouted, clenching his fists. "I saw it with my own eyes, bitch. You spread your legs for my best friend while I worked so hard for us to have this life. Do you still dare to make some excuses for me?" She collapsed back onto the couch, her knees giving way and tears streaming down her cheeks. "Oh my God, James, I'm sorry. Forgive me, I didn't want you to find out. It was a mistake. I was a fool. Error." He stepped towards her, looming over her like a shadow. 2 years is not a mistake, Emily. It's a choice. You chose him. Now listen carefully, because I didn't come for your snot. Everything that is happening to you, now the trial, the foundation, this nonsense in the newspapers, I did it. I set you up. Every piece of paper, every translation, every letter with your signature. This is my revenge, and you deserve it. Emily froze, her tears stopping, as if someone had pressed pause. She looked at him with wide eyes, and her voice became thin as a thread. Are you? What are you doing? Did you fake all of this? James, how could you? How could I? He leaned closer, his face a couple of inches from hers. How could you sleep with him, lie to my face, smile at me every morning as if I meant something to you? Do you think I'll just swallow this crap and continue living like your lap dog? No, Em, I destroyed you. And guess what? I like it. She began to sob, loudly, hysterically, stretching out her hands to him. No, no, James, please don't say that. I love you, I always have. It was stupid. I didn't want to lose you. She fell to her knees, grabbing his pants, her fingers clutching the fabric. Forgive me, I beg you. I'll do anything. Just don't leave me. Don't leave me alone with this. James looked down at her wet face, at her trembling hands, at this pathetic shadow of Emily who had once been the queen of his world. He felt something cracking inside him, not pity, but fatigue, cold and heavy. Are you asking for forgiveness? He said quietly, almost in a whisper. After everything you've done, do you think your tears will change anything? Yes, yes, I know, it's my fault, she sobbed, clinging to him tighter. I was selfish, I was trash, but I don't want to lose you, James. You are my husband, my home. I can't survive without you. Please give me a chance. I will improve, I swear. He grabbed her wrists and pushed her away, harshly but not roughly, causing her to fall back onto the couch. Will you get better? He spat out the word like poison. You're not getting better, Emily. You break everything you touch. You broke our marriage, you broke my faith in you, and now you want me to pick up your pieces. To hell with this. James, no, she screamed, her voice breaking into a screech. Don't go, I beg you, I can't do it alone, I have nowhere to go, everyone has turned their backs on me. You are the only one I have left, forgive me, please, I will do whatever you say. He turned his back to her, walking towards the door, but her scream stopped him for a second. You don't understand what you mean to me, she screamed, crawling along the floor after him. I was weak, I made a mistake, but I love you, James. I love you more than anything in the world. He turned around, looking at her, at this woman who had once been his dream and now lay at his feet like a beaten dog. Do you love? He said, and his voice was cold as steel. You don't know what love is, Emily. You love yourself, your dresses, your parties, and I was just part of your fucking show. Now the show is over. No, 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 she sobbed, gasping for air, her face wet from tears and snot. Don't leave me, James. I won't survive this. I'll die without you. He opened the door, feeling the cold air from the street hit his face. Did you want freedom? He threw over his shoulder without looking at her. Now she's yours. Live with her, bitch. Her cry is, James, broke the silence, but he had already stepped outside, slamming the door so hard that the glass shook. He heard her beating against her from the other side, calling him, sobbing louder, but did not turn around. The car was waiting for him on the street, and he sat behind the wheel, squeezing it until his knuckles turned white. Emily was left there, in the empty house, with her guilt, her tears, her freedom, and he drove away, feeling like the last piece of their past was falling away like a stone from a cliff. Thin rays of the setting sun filtered through the cloudy glass window of an old warehouse on the outskirts of Chicago, turning the rusty beams and dusty concrete crimson. James Wilson stood against the wall, leaning his shoulder against the cold metal, watching Sarah fiddle with the coffee pot on the rickety table they dragged in a couple of hours ago. This place, an abandoned building that he rented through a figurehead, became their temporary refuge, away from prying eyes and the noise of the city. The air smelled of dampness and old oil, but it was quiet here, and silence was what they needed most now. She and Sarah had been sitting here for the third day, sorting out papers, notes, and plans that were supposed to finish off Michael once and for all. But today, the conversation was not about revenge, but about what connected them deeper than they both expected. Sarah finally managed the coffee pot, cursing under her breath as hot water splashed onto her hand. "Damn junk," she muttered, wiping her hand on her jeans, and turned to James, handing him the mug. "Hold it. Not whiskey, of course, but it will warm you up." He took the mug, feeling the warmth through the thin plastic, and nodded. "Thank you. I didn't think that you still remember how much I love coffee black, without sugar." She grinned as she sat down on the box opposite him and took a sip from her mug. "I remember a lot of things, James. How you yelled at me when I stole your old baseball cap. How we fought over the last piece of pie until May hit us with a towel. This is not erased even if 15 years have passed." James looked at her sharp cheekbones and gray eyes, which now seemed so familiar that something sank inside him. 15 years, Sarah. You ran away and I thought you were dead. Why didn't you let me know? At least a postcard, at least something. She looked away, staring at the crack in the floor. What would I write? "Hey, little brother, I'm alive. I escaped from John and his fists. I didn't want you to look for me. You were on your way to Chicago, to your new life. And I just wanted to disappear." Disappear? He put the mug on the table. His voice became harsher. "You were my sister, Sarah. I ran all over Clarion, asking everyone where you went. Mary cried for weeks, and John. Well, he was himself. But I couldn't just forget you." Sarah raised her head, her eyes sparkling. "Do you think it was easy for me? I left with $50 in my pocket, slept in train stations until I got a job as a waitress in some shithole. I didn't mean to drag you through this shit. You were smart, James. You should have gotten out, and I got out." He nodded, but there was something heavy in his gaze. "Got out? And you? How did you end up with Michael, of all the people in this town, with him?" Sarah finished her coffee and set the mug down next to her, her fingers nervously fiddling with the edge of her sleeve. "It didn't happen right away. I came here at 18, changed my last name so that John wouldn't find me. I worked anywhere, then learned to be a secretary. A couple of years ago, I got a job at your company. I didn't know you were there, I swear. Michael was my boss. And he was good to me. At first." James squinted, leaning back. "Good? Is this the Michael I know? Who sleeps with everything that moves and lies like he breathes?" "He was different then," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "That was before Emily, before all this crap. I had just started working. He noticed me, he joked, bought me coffee, and once even gave me a ride home. I was a fool, James. I believed that he cared. We dated for a couple of months secretly, of course. He didn't want the office to know. He said that I was special, that we had a future." He looked at her, feeling the old anger mixed with something new pain for her. "And what happened?" Sarah smiled bitterly, her fingers clenching into a fist. "He left me. He just came one day and said, 'It doesn't work.' That he met someone better. I found out later that it was Emily. He didn't even apologize. He just brushed me off like trash. And then he pretended that nothing had happened. He greeted people in the office as if they were a stranger. I quit after a month, but then came back when I found out he was still there. I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't broken." James shook his head, his voice deeper. "Have you returned to take revenge on him?" "Not right away," she admitted, looking into his eyes. "At first, I just wanted to move on with my life. But then he approached me again a year after I returned. He smiled and flirted as if nothing had happened. I gave him a chance because, hell, I still felt something for him. But this time I was smarter. I recorded him when he boasted about his schemes, his women. I thought it would be useful, and it came in handy." "You wanted to destroy him," James said, and it was not a question, but a statement. "Yes," she nodded, her voice becoming firmer. "He broke me then, James. I loved him, but he spat in my soul. When I found out about Emily, about how he plays with both of you, I realized that he will not change, and I decided that he would pay. And then I met you in that cafe, and everything worked out. We both want one thing for this bastard to collapse." James stood up and walked around the warehouse, his boots squeaking on the concrete. "You could have left, Sarah. Start again, without all this dirt. Why did you stay? Why are you?" she retorted, standing up behind him. "You could have divorced Emily, thrown Michael out of the firm, and moved on with your life. But you are here with me in this barn, making plans to crush them. We're the same, James. We don't leave until we pay back." He stopped, looking at her through the darkness. "You're right. I didn't leave, and I won't leave until they realize what they've lost." Sarah came closer, her face illuminated by the faint light from the window. "Then we're together, brother. You and I are against them. Like when we were kids, when we threw rocks at John's jar, remember? Only now the target is bigger." James nodded, feeling the old bonds that had been torn apart by time begin to mend. "I remember, and now we won't miss it." She held out her hand, and he shook it firmly, just like back in Clarion, when they were children against the world. "Sister and brother," she said quietly. "Let them regret that they underestimated us." "Let it be," he answered, and there was steel in his voice. They stood there for another minute, looking at each other, two ghosts of the past, ready to become the nightmare of the present. Evening light filtered through a gap in the curtains of James Wilson's new office, painting the walls a soft orange hue. He stood at the coffee machine, listening to the machine hiss, spitting black streams into a plastic cup, and thought how strange this moment felt the beginning of something new after so many months of destruction. Behind him, Sarah Johnson, his sister, returned from the past like a ghost made flesh, was laying out the first contracts on a table that still smelled of fresh varnish. Wilson and Johnson, their law practice forged from pain, revenge, and shared blood, had opened its doors only a week ago, but already promised to become their new home. Chicago hummed outside, indifferent to their victories and losses, while he and Sarah built a future on the ruins of the past. Sarah threw the folder onto the table, cursing as the corner bent. "Damn, these clients think we're their babysitters," she said, looking at James. "Do you make coffee or meditate on it?" He grinned, handing her the glass. "I do. Are you still drinking that sugary drink?" "And you're still boring," she replied, taking the coffee and sitting down in the chair. "The Millers signed a contract. Meeting tomorrow at 10. This is our first big step, brother. Don't screw it up." James sat down opposite him, sipping his black coffee without sugar. "I won't screw it up. We've come too far to screw it up now." She nodded, her gray eyes the same as his flashed in the semi-darkness. "From Clarion to this office. Who would have thought that we would get out of that hole and open our own business? I thought," he said quietly, "even when you ran away, I knew that we wouldn't rot there." Sarah smiled, but there was a shadow of old pain in her smile. "You have always been stubborn, and I just wanted to breathe. Now let's breathe together." They fell silent, listening to the hum of cars outside the window. Michael Davis was in the past, his empire collapsed, his clients fled, and he himself disappeared, leaving behind a trail of debt and shame. Emily. Emily was left somewhere out there, alone, which she herself had chosen when she betrayed him. James hadn't seen her since the night he'd confronted her with the truth, but he felt like she was still clinging to the pieces of their lives like a lifeline. The next day he arrived at the office before Sarah, carrying a box of papers from the Millers. On the table in the reception area lay an envelope, white, simple, with his name written in shaky handwriting. "Emily." He froze, feeling his fingers tighten around the box. The envelope was thin, but it carried the weight of everything he had left behind. Sarah came in next, slamming the door, and stopped when she noticed his gaze. "What is this?" she asked, throwing her bag on the chair. "A letter," he answered, without taking his eyes off the envelope. "From her." Sarah narrowed her eyes, crossing her arms. "What will you do? Will you read her snot or throw it away?" James shook his head, picking up the envelope. Neither one nor the other. He walked to a small fireplace in the corner, old, but working, left by the previous owners. Taking out matches from the desk drawer, he struck one, and a tiny flame illuminated his face. Bringing the fire to the envelope, he watched as the paper flared up, curling into black curls. Ashes fell into the fireplace, and he felt only cold relief. "That's it," he said, throwing the rest into the fire and turning to Sarah. Emily Wilson sat on the floor in the corner of her bedroom, surrounded by silence that became her prison. The windows were closed, the curtains were drawn, and the air in the room smelled of dust and wine that she had not cleaned for weeks. In front of her lay a notebook filled with drafts of the letter she had sent to James. She put everything into it, her guilt, her tears, her plea. "James, I know that I destroyed us, but I beg you to forgive. You were everything to me, and I lost you. Give me at least a drop of hope." She sent it, throwing the envelope into the drawer with trembling hands, and waited, looking at the blank screen of the phone that did not ring. But there was no answer. No sound, no sign. She knew he had received the letter, the post office confirmed it, but the silence screamed louder than any words. Emily stood up, leaning against the wall, and walked over to the chest of drawers, where there was a stack of old photographs of her and James, happy, laughing. Her fingers trembled as she took one from their wedding and ran it across his face. She remembered his voice, his warmth, his gaze, which had once been her home, and now he was gone, leaving her with this freedom that she hated. The house was empty, the Mercedes had been taken, the furniture was put up for sale along with the building itself, and the friends she considered family had long forgotten her name. The court handed down a sentence, a suspended sentence, a fine that she could not pay, and a stigma that could not be washed away. Even Linda, her mother, turned away, muttering something about her way when Emily asked for help. She collapsed on the bed, looking up at the ceiling where the shadows of the street lamps made patterns. Her world, her throne, her crown, her life burned down, and she was left alone in this room with this silence. Tears flowed down her cheeks, but she did not wipe them away. James hadn't forgiven, wouldn't come back, and she knew it. She lost everything, not only him, but herself. And at that moment, looking into emptiness, she realized this was her end. The lonely queen, forgotten by everyone, was left with the ghosts of the past that she herself created. James and Sarah sat in their office, discussing a new contract. Outside the window, Chicago was turning on the lights, and the city lived its own life, not knowing their path. They built the future one thing at a time, one step at a time, leaving Emily in her solitude, in her ashes. The last piece of their old life burned in the fireplace, and now they looked only forward, together, like sister and brother, standing against everything. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.